So previously we had Breakout Esports, which I covered the tournament that happened a while ago, and the pro scene that was surrounding it. And Pro Hubs hosted their Season 0, as they're calling it, which is essentially a test trial for their first pro league. It taught the hosts and the players a lot, and today I want to explore the tactics, the loadouts, and overall metas that we saw develop in the scene, and highlight some of the fascinating outcomes that derived from the regions finally facing off. A pretty spectacular showdown near the end. Also, before we get into these details, the tourney was hosted on Twitch at Pro Hubs TF. I was unable to grab footage of the tourney, so no gameplay of it on screen. Unfortunately, I am quite busy, so reaching out to get some of the footage might take a little bit too long for my timeline, so I'd encourage you to check out the channel and watch it yourself. I'll simply visually show you some of the loadouts and weapons or anything that is to note as we go along with some of my own gameplay in the background. Now, this is not the official pro scene that's hosted by the finals. That's going to be coming up a little bit later, so this is sort of the community-run pro scene. So to very quickly explain the tourney, this was a mix of invited top players who have proven themselves previously and qualifiers where teams got to compete in order to make it into this tournament. This was hosted by Pro Hubs, as I mentioned before, the best place for the current esports scene in the finals. Now, I was tempted to do a breakdown of the pick rates as I did during the Breakout Esports tourney and try to make a little bit of a conclusion there, but I really don't want to do that because it would actually be very misleading information to give you guys, because the qualifiers actually started in the previous season, and as the tournaments were played, there were many meta changes because of some of the balance changes we got over the season. This did last quite a bit. There was pretty drastic meta shifts, playstyles, and even teams. Many players and teams actually fully changed. So I will simply highlight loadouts that stuck out as being the best after watching the entire tournament. And I'll try to give a little bit of an explanation, because I do think sometimes the information I give, people might take it too much at face value and not fully understand where the pick is coming from or the reason why. And there's also a pretty big difference between a 3v3 and a full-on cash-out round and the meta that surrounds those. But we'll try and cover, each class, their weapons, gadgets, specs, and we'll talk about what's strong outside of those meta loadouts and why they were picked in certain situations. So let's get into the pro lights that we saw and what they were running. The most common loadout was Dash, XP54, Thermal Vision, Gateway, and Glitch. This stood out as being a very strong loadout and one of the most consistent that we saw throughout the entire tourney. However, in the 3v3 rounds, we did see Thermal Vision picked up slightly less, often opted for sonar grenades. With all the debris falling and chaos that happens in cash-out rounds, it seems Lights really valued Thermal a lot. Another thing to consider is the frequency of controller players that were on Light. A large portion of Lights actually use controller, and normally smoke or debris, the various explosions that would be considered vision blockers, will cause the controller's aim assist to stop working. However, if they're using thermal vision on a controller, your aim assist won't be interrupted. For that reason, I believe this is why we mainly saw mouse and keyboard players swap off of thermal vision from time to time, even though for the mouse and keyboard players, thermal vision was still a very popular choice. Now let's cover the weapons we saw that performed well enough to keep returning. The XP54 being the most popular choice. The ARN220 was seen quite a bit. However, this did feel kind of map dependent. The Matter shotgun on Light was a pretty surprising one to see perform so well, along with the SH1900, the double barrel shotgun. Both of these actually saw some pretty decent pick rates, and some other weapons spotted that were good that I did want to note was the M11, the 9.3R, and even one Brave Bow player who did actually very well with it. Unfortunately, was a little bit busy and was unable to compete in the final section of the tourney, despite their team qualifying. But sometimes real life gets in the way. For specialization, in EU it seemed Cloak was the more common, and in NA, Dash was the go-to pick. For gadgets, we mainly saw Thermal Vision, Gateway, Glitchnade. However, the other gadgets that popped up were Sonar Grenade, potentially the most popular outside of the three. And I think for good reason, the Sonar Grenade is a pretty solid alternative to using Thermal Vision. The Vanish Bomb was used a bit, but mainly on shotgun players. And the Nullifier saw a bit of play, and again, this was typically used with shotgun players, and What we saw from the tournament was that the Nullifier was not a very viable pick and slowly kind of became irrelevant. Grenade was used a bit, and it was typically an overall team strategy that was determining if they were bringing a Grenade or not, such as enabling a heavy player who was using a melee weapon. Obviously Sledge, I mean, that's the only melee we were really seeing. When another teammate didn't want to bring Goo, then the Light might bring it, but it wasn't really a staple pick for any Light. The Smoke Grenade was used a bit and was more common in cash-out rounds where they might be able to cheese a free steal by using it. Now for medium, there was a bit of variety, but there was one loadout that had small variations that stood out the most. DMAT, Cerberus, Defib, Grenade, and Jump Pad, with a swap to FAMAS depending on the player, but this did seem to be the most dominant playstyle for medium we saw in the tournament. The Cerberus was actually not used too much in the EU, but slowly took over in both regions as the season went on. Even after the nerf, this was still an S tier pick in this tournament. This was sometimes map dependent or even input dependent, and what I mean by that is that we saw controller players tend to use FAMAS instead of Cerberus in almost all cases, but there were still some cases where controller players did use Cerberus. And it seems like the aim assist suits a playstyle that is more about tracking in mid-range engagements more than close-range engagements. That didn't stop some controller lights from using shotguns though. For weapons, Cerberus and FAMAS, as I mentioned, were the top two picks. Some notable picks for FCAR, we saw the Pike on some maps. The longer range maps where Pike seems to shine a bit more was sometimes a determining factor in a lot of fights. Some other weapons were picked, but nothing seemed to shine outside of these. For specialization, Dematerializer was the dominant pick across the board. For gadgets, the best pick seemed to change regionally, and Team Comp played a pretty big impact in the decisions here. But the top three were Defib, Grenade, and Jump Pad. And in EU, we saw more APS over Grenade. Both regions would bring out gas mines from time to time. It was a good tactic that allowed them to stall the cash out. And while Data Reshaper, in my opinion, could have been a pretty good counter to a Lockbolt or gas mines, we really didn't see Data Reshaper make much of a relevance in the scene. When the heavy meta was forming, it was kind of weird at first, and it went through some pretty drastic changes, and there was a lot of variety in the loadouts that we saw from heavies. But there were two that really seemed to shine above the rest, and that is the classic Mesh SA-12, RPG, C4, and Dome Shield loadout that has been meta basically since day one. This was a very common playstyle used by almost all of the top teams. And then something that shined a lot more in the cash-out round specifically was Mesh, Minigun, Lockbolt, C4, and Dome. This was a very dominant playstyle in the cash-out mode because it seemed to enable teams to play a little bit more aggressively and take those fights when there are plenty of players on screen. However, it did lose a little bit of value in the 3v3 phase, and this was potentially due to the SA-12 changes that happened around the time that we were transitioning to the 3v3s, or the inability to react fast to being pushed when you are using minigun, as you have that wind-up time. This often means that you have to be the aggressor in fights, and if you're trying to defend a cash out, you don't always want to be aggressive, so the minigun might have played a little bit awkwardly for some of these players, and that might have been why they dropped it for the SA-12 in most cases. Outside of the SA-12 and the minigun, some notable weapons that we saw that did really well were the Lewis, the M60, the Deagles, the Shack 50, and one big mention is the Sledgehammer. And of all these options, the Sledgehammer seemed to be a pretty huge problem for a lot of teams. Especially in the cash-out rounds, the Sledgehammer seemed to dominate, being able to just throw a ton of goo, creating these areas where if you're in winch distance, you essentially just instantly die because you get winched into a Sledge and a Cerberus. This made for some very easy cash-out rounds, but when it came to the 3v3s, the Sledge did seem to struggle a little bit more, but it still seemed to be a really strong pick. And I was pretty surprised to see a Sledgehammer perform so well in the pro scene. But the strategies that we saw some of these teams develop really showed that it is a pretty simple tactic to do, but a lot of people haven't really thought of it, and it is really effective. Spamming a ton of goo grenades on almost all your players on your team, and just forcing a bunch of close range engagements was surprisingly easy to do. Holding a cash out became super easy for a lot of these Sledge teams, and I'm really interested to see where the strategies develop from here, because this was probably one of the first times that some of these pro teams got to face off against Sledgehammers that had full-on strategy. The winch really enabled the Sledge in order to bring cash outs close up and force those close range engagements, whereas some teams in EU actually use the winch in order to pull cash outs far away. This seems to be a pretty simple tactic of just cash out manipulating to force engagements that suit you and your team. So when it comes to the heavy meta, it was a really interesting one to watch because there was actually the most variety that we saw, and a lot of things just happened to succeed really well. The class does seem to be quite balanced at this point. For the specialization, the mesh was very strong, the most dominant pick in the tournament, and that was followed by winch. No other specs really shined in this tourney. The gadgets varied a little bit from region to region or the team comps that they were playing in, but some of the ones that stood out were Lockbolt, RPG, C4, and Dome Shield. These all felt the most popular, with the Lockbolt and RPG sort of being swapped out. For some people, like the Sledge players, they used Grenade. We even saw Barricade a little bit in the EU scene, and overall, Heavy felt quite varied, which was pretty nice. Now for some more interesting outcome that we got from the Grand Finals and the period where EU and NA actually got to face off, we got to see some drastically different metas face off, and what strategies kind of came out on top, and what have we learned from this? Well, we learned for Light, Dash was superior. EU slowly has been adapting the Dash meta, and a lot of NA teams were basically just stuck on Dash, and they really showed how superior that pick was. The medium strategies revolving around the APS turret became inefficient when cross-region, and the Grenade slowly took over and became more valuable. Gas Mine, originally an EU strat, has been played a little bit more in NA, and actually seems to be pretty good and is getting some good success in both regions. We also saw that NA's love for shotguns has infected EU, and Cerberus slowly became a dominant pick in both regions. However, like I mentioned before, a lot of the controller players tended to just stick with the FAMAS. But that doesn't mean that MK players were not using the FAMAS as well to very good success. For Heavy, the NA's dominant spec choice of Mesh was proven to be the stronger pick once Lockbolt strategies finally were used on EU. And this would be where we use the Lockbolt in order to drag the cash out station around, often paired with a Dash player who holds a canister. Then the Heavy shoots the Lockbolt at the canister while they're standing near the cash out. It locks onto it, and the Dash player just drags it away. It seems like this was a strategy that EU was not really using much at all, while NA was using it for quite some time. And it seemed to make the winch strategy of dragging the cash out into an open spot become a little bit irrelevant when you can do it with a Lockbolt instead. And in 3v3s, it does seem like the mesh holds a really good weight when you're facing against good players who don't give you that opportunity to hit the winch on you. However, only time is going to tell what metas are going to form in each region, and based on the streamers that I've been watching in both regions, it does seem like this competition has impacted some of the top players, and they've been slowly adapting new strategies, new weapons, new gadgets that they learned from this tournament. But we're going to see, depending on patches and all the strategies that develop in each region, we might see a new meta form by the next tourney. Thank you to ProHubs for hosting this tourney. Good job to all the players involved. Congrats to After Hours for winning. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. Thank you to all my YouTube members. Now remember, popularity does not equal strength. Metas only change when a strong player is willing to beat it. Learning the meta is the first step to countering it. Find what suits you best, and I will see you in the finals.